Hello and welcome everybody. I am Sue Sanders from Schools Out UK and the founder of LGBT History Month. I'm so excited to be working with both Dan and the British Library and the wonderful people you are about to meet in launching this, our 15th LGBT+ History Month. Delivering this event digitally for the first time has its challenges, but I do hope it means more people can join us. Schools Out UK was started back in 1974 by a bunch of lesbian and gay teachers who wanted to support each other's pioneering work challenging heteronormativity. LGBT History Month was our response to the end of Section 28 and the welcome news of the then Labour government planning a single equality policy. We wanted to move from victim to celebrate, explore, and make visible LGBT+ people in all our diversity. To enable you to be part of the month, you can visit the website where there is an interactive calendar for you to put up your events and so many free resources for you to use, and in due course, this very video. The current badge and lanyards are available in the shop, and they are our main source of funding. Hopefully, we will inspire the visibility of LGBT+ people all year round, for February is an open door for all of us to use to educate out prejudice. And now I'm going to welcome Dan, who's done all the work to start us off.
Thank you very much, Sue. I am very excited to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming along. Before we start, we've actually got some housekeeping, so I'll just do that right now, which is if you've got any questions during the event, you can submit them using the question box below. Some of the questions will be put to the panel after the presentations. And you can also use the menu that's above us to provide us with feedback. And you can also donate to the British Library because like Schools Out UK, it is a charity and your support helps open up a world of knowledge and inspiration for everyone. Now, the event will be live speech to text captioned, and you can find the link in the button below that will enable captions. And thank you very much to Louisa McDade for providing those captions. You can also click on the bookshop link at the top of the video as well to see a range of books from Gaze the Word. They'll make a special guest appearance tonight, so keep an eye out for them as well. So tonight we're going to unveil the LGBT+ History Month theme for next year, which is going to be mind, body, and spirit. And we've got some amazing guest speakers I can't wait to introduce. They're going to be sharing the story of 5 icons for the next year. Michael Dillon, dubbed Bristol's most famous trans resident, presented by Bristol MShed and author Cheryl Morgan, co-chair of Out Stories Bristol. We've also got Olympic athlete Mark Weston, the Devonshire Wonder, presented by University of Plymouth, and Alan Butler, co-director of Pride in Plymouth. Renowned poet Maya Angelou, presented by Haringey Vanguard, and historian and writer Kamara Dyer, as well as activist Mark Ashton, who was immortalised in the award-winning film Pride. His story is going to be shared by Mike Jackson from Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors. But to start off, we actually have a video from the first woman to be inducted into the English Football Hall of Fame, Lily Parr. It's going to be followed by a presentation by Lou Engelfield as well. So as they say on the pitch, let's kick off.
That I will play for England and follow Lily Parr's footsteps.
We're really excited about being able to celebrate the life and achievements of Lily Parr. We've always recognised her as a pioneer of the women's game, and we inducted her into our Hall of Fame in 2002. Lily played football at a time of huge change in the women's game, when women's football really captured the public imagination. Games attracted huge crowds, and women's first international matches were being played. Like women before and after her, Lily used her tenacity, skill and passion for the game to help make sure that despite some of the negative attitudes of her time, women's football survived and went on to thrive.
As a trans woman, it's important to see pioneers like Lily Parr being celebrated for what she represents to women and girls in the game. As campaign lead for Football v Transphobia, I look back on the ban on women players 100 years ago and it feels just as antiquated as I hope restrictions on trans people competing will one day appear. I'm delighted to see a woman and a footballer like Lily Parr be chosen as a hero for LGBT History Month because I think she is and will continue to be a huge inspiration to generations of girls.
In our collection at the National Football Museum, in addition to the statue of Lily Parr, we've got lots of objects that relate to her and the Dick Kerr ladies. Lily Parr's legacy lives on. Her colours are still worn by Knowsley St Helens girls, and they wear her close to their hearts. There's also many players who compete in her honour. For example, the London Lesbian Kickabouts, who in 2007, as part of LGBT plus History Month, started the Lily Parr tournament. At the National Football Museum, we absolutely adore showing objects that relate to Lily Parr. She's such an inspiration, not only to young girls and women and others that want to play football now, but to everybody who enjoys football. Her tenacity, her spirit, the fact that she continued to play football in spite of the restrictions by the Football Association, just say everything about what football means to people and why it's so important for people to play. She is one of the women that played in the 1920s, but she stands for all of the women that campaigned and fought to play football in her generation and since.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lou Engelfield, Director of LGBTIQ+ Sports Development and Inclusion Organisation Pride Sports and Campaign Director of Football versus Homophobia. I'm delighted to be talking to you this evening about football legend Lily Parr. Lily Parr was a cigarette-smoking, over 900 goal-scoring, gender role-smashing woman who rejected the prescriptive normativity of her time and lived with another woman for most of her adult life. Her footballing career started at just 14 years of age. Lily Parr is an absolute icon for me as a queer sports activist. If only I'd have been as good a footballer as her. Not only could Lily kick a ball like a mule, to quote one of her teammates, and not only is she one of the most celebrated female footballers of all time, she and her teammates drew enormous crowds to matches and raised huge amounts of money for charity, the equivalent of millions of pounds in today's money. At first, the charities her team, Dick Kerr Ladies, raised money for were those that focused on injured servicemen following the First World War. But in 1921, during the miners' lockout, a period of 3 months when mine owners tried to lower the wages of mine workers by 50%, Dick Kerr Ladies raised money for local miners' welfare causes and plays matches in mining communities, both in Wales and Scotland. Which kind of brings me to the current day. Dick Kerr Ladies beat everyone they played, rather like the current US national women's team. Not only are the US national women's team fantastic at football, but players on the team are constantly challenging the status quo. Last year, all 28 members of the team filed class action lawsuits against US soccer for institutionalized gender discrimination and alleged discrimination over pay, training facilities, coaching, medical treatment, and travel conditions. In addition, their Ballon d'Or winning star player, Megan Rapinoe, was one of the first professional athletes outside the NFL to follow Colin Kaepernick's example and take a knee during the US national anthem in protest of racial injustice in the United States. And of course, football activism doesn't just happen in the women's game. During the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen Manchester United striker Marcus Rashford hold the government to account and help provide meals for some of the poorest children in the UK. But back to Lily Parr and Dick Kerr Ladies. As many of you will know, the English FA banned women's football from 1921 to 1971, an act which saw teams like Dick Kerr Ladies go from playing football at professional clubs in front of tens of thousands of fans to playing on parks and village greens. In England today, the women's game has grown enormously. 1.6 million viewers tuned in to watch the Women's FA Cup final last Sunday. But did you know that the Dick Kerr Ladies' record attendance for a women's game of 53,000 spectators was only broken last year, almost 100 years after it was set? It's taken 50 years for women's football to recover from the 50-year ban, which was more about policing gender and class than it was about the beautiful game. The women's game owes a huge debt of gratitude to Lily Parr, the first superstar of women's football, who scored more than 980 goals in her 32-year career, who didn't let an FA ban stop her. Her legacy can be seen in the unstoppable rise of the women's game and a growing acceptance that football is for everyone. I'm now going to hand over to Cheryl Morgan on behalf of Outstories Bristol and Bristol MShed, and we'll start with a film about Michael Dillon.
The 19th, early 20th century was very repressive in terms of all sorts of LGBT plus identities. So being gay was illegal. Trans people in general were completely invisible. And then as we moved through the early 20th century, we began to actually see people starting to undergo modern medical transition. And Michael Dillon was one of those. He wasn't a Bristol native, but he came to live in Bristol just before the start of the Second World War. He'd got an Oxford degree. He was working at a medical laboratory in South Gloucestershire. And he learned about a doctor in Bristol called George Foss, who had been experimenting with a new drug called testosterone. And Foss was trying to treat women in Bristol with testosterone. And of course, testosterone did what it does. It started to give facial hair and muscle bulk and causes the voice to break and things. And these women he was treating were deeply unhappy about this. And Michael Dillon went to see Foss and said, you know, those side effects that this testosterone has on women, I'd like some of that. Now, Dillon at the time was obviously still living as a woman, but even in his time at Oxford, he dressed in a very masculine fashion. He kept his hair cut short and so on. His big name in the Oxford ladies rowing team, and still kept up the rowing when he came to Bristol. So he was presenting in a very masculine way for a woman, and he felt that by taking testosterone that would enable him to present in a much more masculine way and perhaps live socially as a man. Dillon was lucky enough to meet somebody who was a plastic surgeon. This was a chap called Harold Gillis, later Sir Harold, who was a New Zealander, and he was the world's top expert in plastic surgery. So Dillon met Gillis, and Gillis thought that it would be an interesting thing to do to try to create a penis through plastic surgery. Never been done before, as far as anybody knew. It took an awful lot of experimentation, 13 separate operations in total, which must have been fairly horrendous for poor Dillon, but there it was. This was the first ever creation of a phallus by plastic surgery in the world, from somebody who was living in Bristol when he started it out. So we have a very proud place in trans history. Hello, I'm Cheryl Morgan from Outstories Bristol. I'll be talking on behalf of ourselves and the MShed Museum. Michael Dillon is an ideal face for 2021's LGBT History Month. As an intellectual, he wrote a treatise on healthcare for trans people that was decades ahead of its time. As a sportsman, he was a keen rower, captaining Oxford ladies prior to transition and rowing for Trinity Dublin as a man later in life. He was also the first Western European to be ordained as a Buddhist monk. His pioneering role as both a patient and a doctor in medical gender treatment is well known. But today, I want to talk about Michael Dillon, the man. What sort of fellow was he? At Outstories Bristol, we work closely with MShed, the People's History Museum in Bristol. Dillon lived in the city during World War II, and consequently he experienced some famous incidents in Bristol's history. Records of those incidents help us fill in details of Dillon's life. This is the story of one such incident. During the war, Dillon worked at a car dealership called College Motors in the centre of the city. By this time, he was taking testosterone and trying to live as a man. The staff at the garage knew about his background and treated him badly, but the owner found Dillon's upper-class accent went down well with the customers, and Dillon made one lifelong friend. Gilbert Barrow had grown up in a local orphanage, which is perhaps why he stood up for Dillon against their workmates. Dillon and Barrow both slept overnight at the garage, earning an extra 10 shillings a week for acting as a night watch in case of air raids. This resulted in the pair of them having late-night adventures during the notorious Good Friday Blitz. Winston Churchill was due to visit Bristol on April the 11th, 1941, to take part in an honorary degree ceremony at the university where he was Chancellor. The Luftwaffe took the opportunity to send him a message and spent the night before pounding the city with high explosives for 6 hours. Dillon notes there was 1,000 tons of petrol in the garage, and nothing would have been left of them if a bomb had hit. Fortunately, College Motors was spared, but a bomb fell upon John Wright and Sons printworks on the hill behind them. Dillon's boss had rented a small house on a nearby steep and narrow lane called Christmas Steps. He used it to store tyres, which were extremely valuable at the time as they were in great demand by the military. With the air full of burning paper and one house on Christmas Steps already on fire, Dillon and Barrow knew that they had to act. In his autobiography, Dillon writes as follows. The wave of bombers had passed, so we could safely leave the garage for a few minutes. We ran up the street, and I leapt up the stairs and rolled tyres down to Gilbert at the bottom, who sent them on their way down the sloping lane with a shove. Big tyres and small tyres bounced down. They were all brand new. Then the flames began licking at the stairs, and Gilbert called me down. We collected all those who'd stopped on the way and piled them outside the fish and chip shop on the corner. A special constable stopped us from going back to see if there was anything more we could do. It was just as well. In 10 minutes' time, a second high explosive, which had fallen into John Wright's All Unknown, went off, and the roof of the house flew up in the air, and tyres we had left went sailing out of the window in all directions. So there you have it, Michael Dillon, action hero. He was 25 at the time, and Barrow was probably still a teenager. We also know from local papers that Dillon regularly donated money to the Red Cross during the war. And in his medical book, Self, he wrote passionately in favour of founding a national health service. He was certainly someone who cared about other people. I'm now going to hand over to our friends and colleagues from Plymouth. We'll start with a film about Mark Weston.
Hi, my name's Eric. I'm a 22-year-old transgender man. I was born and raised in Plymouth, and I'm living here currently, and I'm here to talk about Mark Weston's story. A trans man in the 1930s. I read his story as a teenager, and I think it had a very profound effect on me as a young trans man. Especially someone who was so successful, like an Olympian, and he medically transitioned and he had a wife. Just so much of LGBT history, especially trans history, has been kind of erased or lost or just was undocumented. Seeing these stories and preserving these stories feels especially important. And it would be great for kind of future generations of trans people to know more about the origins of the community as well. I've been involved with Pride in Plymouth for quite a long time. I first got involved through a youth group when I was about 13, I think. And I'm very excited about the Rainbow Connections exhibition in the Box. The Box is a local museum, and the aim of the project is to kind of pass down more information about trans history from generation to generation. Hopefully, young trans people in the future will be able to have more of a sense of their local heritage. I think when I first came out, I assumed that I must be the first and only trans person in Plymouth. So by the time I'd read Mark's story, I'd met other trans people living in Plymouth, but to see the kind of representation in the archive of a man like myself, who'd transitioned back in the 30s as well, it helped me shed sort of an alienated feeling. I suddenly felt like I had a history in the town, and it definitely helped foster kind of a sense of community and belonging in Plymouth.
Hello, everybody. My name's Alan Butler, and I'm beaming out to you tonight from inside Pride in Plymouth's Plymouth LGBT Community Archive. So you can see all sorts of archival stuff around me, including a picture of Mark Weston, whose story I'd like to share briefly with you tonight. Plymouth's always had a bit of a reputation for athletes. We've got people like Sharon Davis, and we've got people like Tom Daly, who you may have heard of. One story that's sort of not so well known, but actually I think even more exciting, is the story of Mark Weston, who was born in Arreston, which is a small village in the Plymouth area, in 1905, an intersex person who was assigned as female from birth. So Mary Louise Edith Weston went on to compete in a number of athletics and field events and became known as the Devonshire Wonder, which is quite a nice title to have, really, isn't it? In 1929, Mary became the national champion in javelin throw and discus throw, which you probably can't see too well from this picture, but trust me, there's some real throwing going on there. And in 1936, Mary travelled to Charing Cross to consult with a number of doctors. And what followed that consultation was Mark Edward Lewis Weston returning back to the city of Plymouth after two, what they referred to as relatively simple corrective surgeries, but were described at the time as being unusual. What's particularly interesting, I think, about this is the Dr. Lennox Broster, Harley Street surgeon, actually provided Mark with a doctor's note that said that Mark Weston, who has always been brought up as female, is male and should continue to live as such. And what was lovely is returning back to Plymouth with that doctor's certificate meant that the Plymouth community kind of accepted that, took that as fine, which is great. The local press actually became very interested in Mark, and he did gain a degree of local celebrity, although he was quite keen to avoid it. There are various newspaper reports and different articles in the local paper, the Western Morning News, all of which were very sort of respectful and interested too, I guess, in Mark's transition. He told the papers that he felt now that he had no business in competing in women's games. And while the competition had been carried out in good faith, he had no objection to giving up the records. That never happened, though. Nobody actually asked for those to be returned. So that was quite interesting. He told the local paper that he felt he was now living in his true element, which was a really nice phrase, I think, which we really liked when we were researching this story, and we featured that in an exhibition we held in the museum when we talked about Mark's story. He was much happier for that, although he did say that he found polite etiquette a little bit problematic to getting used to, and he struggled a bit to remember to open doors for ladies and perhaps raise a hat for them. You won't, I'm sure, be able to see this, but this is my absolute favourite article from the newspapers about Mark. And the headline, which I'm sure you can't see, says that ex-woman athlete made male by surgery says he is learning to do manly, polite things, but the sight of his own trousers still startles him, which I just think is lovely. Just that was the approach, that was how people felt, a sort of polite interest. I'm still working on polite, manly things myself, to be honest, so we'll see how we go. I don't know if you could make out from the article, it does mention that this person was a bridegroom. And upon his return the same year, Mark actually married a lady called Alberta Bray, who had been a childhood friend of his. Mary and her had been members of the same women's athletic club. And they were married that year and went on to live quite a quiet life in Arreston, just a stone's throw away from the house in which he was born. Mark never actually went back to athletics and continued to further his interest in massage. So the theme of mind, body and spirit fits very well for Mark, really. A slightly less happy side to the story is the story of his brother Harry, who was also assigned female at birth and also became a patient of Lennox Broster. But he sadly took his own life in 1942 as a result of depression. So it's just a timely reminder for all of us that, you know, queer lives are not always easy. And, you know, there's a lot of challenges which we face. Mark and Alberta, though, went on to live a long life together. And Mark finally passed away in Plymouth's Freedom Fields Hospital in 1978. And his stories become a really important part of the archive, much in the way that Eric talked about, in seeing, you know, something of ourselves in heritage, something of ourselves in history, and somewhere in like Plymouth, which is perhaps a little bit off the beaten track for some people, to see that kind of story and reflected, it's really exciting. So I'm really happy to be here tonight and be able to share a little bit of his story with you. So I'm now going to hand over to Kamara Dyer Sims from the Haringey Vanguard, and we'll start with a film about Maya Angelou. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Olivette Cole-Wilson, and I'm here on behalf of Haringey Vanguard. Maya Angelou was a formidable woman, multi-talented actress, writer, public speaker, all sorts of things, poet of course, who had suffered adversity but had come up through that and was a force to be reckoned with. The first time I read Maya Angelou, I was probably in my early 20s. I think it was her poetry that I first discovered before the books and the novels. And of course, Still I Rise and Phenomenal Woman are the two main poems that stand out for me. I'm really excited that Maya Angelou is going to be the 2021 icon for LGBT History Month. And I think it's important for young children to realise that they can be who they want to be, and they can do and achieve so many great things. And I think her works are really inspirational. Now I'd like to read you a bit of one of Maya Angelou's poems, a really famous one, And Still I Rise. It really encompasses that thought, that feeling that you have to be who you are. And even if people try and put you down and they criticise you or whatever it is, I think it's really important to rise above the adversities. And so that's why I think this poem is a great poem for everybody. Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me down in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I rise. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide. Welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bring in the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise. I rise. I rise.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kamara Dyer Sims. I'd first like to lead us all in taking a collective breath in honour of Maya Angelou's memory and as a grounding tool to honour the grief that we're all gathered here in this virtual space may be sitting with. I can't actually see you all, which is often a detriment to how gathering in the virtual space works. So I'm hoping this will help us feel more connected, at least energetically, and help us to practice a mechanism of collective care. So we'll be taking a breath in for 4 counts, holding for 4, and a breath out for 4 counts. So breathing in, 2, 3, 4, holding, 2, 3, 4, and breathing out, 2, 3, 4. Thank you to the British Library and to Dan for inviting me here this evening to talk about a woman whose words and absence of words have held and continue to hold me in my mind, body, and spirit, as the name of the event put so aptly. The things I hope we're able to hold resonance with today is Dr. Angelou's practice of care, accountability, and exchange that she gifted us with as a poet, memoirist, and activist. We just saw the wonderful Olivette Cole-Wilson in the video, who continuously shares her wisdom and life stories, the Haringey Vanguard project, which I had the pleasure to work on recently. The Haringey Vanguard project conducts oral history interviews to record the stories of radical activism in the London Borough of Haringey during the 1970s to 1990s by Black, Asian and minority ethnic LGBTQ+ community members and their wider social and cultural impact. One of the central tenets of the project is intergenerational dialogue, which ties not only into outreach, but also communal remembrance. The project was born from BAME LGBTQ+ elders in the community concerned that their contributions to our ongoing struggle towards liberation would be forgotten and erased from the archive. Dr. Angelou achieved this transcendence of linear temporality through the timelessness of her words and their embodied resonance. I don't want to ascribe queerness onto Dr. Angelou that she did not claim in life, because that's a strong personal value of mine. So I'm not going to sit here and call her bisexual or try to define her sexuality or find meaning in what her business was to share or not to share. What I will say is what is resonant here is her fierce support for the LGBTQ+ community and her proactive work as an ally. As a Black British queer person living today, and as a writer myself, I think a lot about the permanence of African diasporic stories in addressing both the totality of Blackness and anti-Blackness and justice strategies that can be learnt from that. I know the tools at my disposal as a facilitator and generally considerate person are dialogue and mutual aid. I know Dr. Angelou gave me the language to start thinking about those things. Because of the nature of embodied archives and the temporal manipulation that fiction, and I would say autobiographies, also allow for, Dr. Angelou's message of care above the value of our output or the content we produce transcends the carceral logics of time that often feeds the anti-Blackness, queerphobia and transphobia that exists in the world. Dr. Angelou was traumatized by abuse as a child and was mute for almost 6 years, and she was a survivor, so her work is trauma-informed. Her life offerings are of both care and of critique, to not only acknowledge structural inequalities, but also the structural power we hold to move, to fight with the wisdom of Black, queer and trans folks in the wider LGBTQ+ community. Moving in Dr. Angelou's lesson of loving kindness toward understanding, realization, self-belief, and community affirmation and accountability, which is really resonant within the Black radical tradition. She says it better than me in her poem, In and Out of Time. We have loved each other in and out, in and out, in and out of time. I'm now going to hand over to Mike Jackson, who will be talking about Mark Ashton for Lesbian and Gay Support the Minors, and I will start with a video.
Hi, I'm Mike Jackson. I am Secretary of Lesbians and Gay Support the Minors, now as I was 35 years ago. Hello, Jim. Myself and Mark Ashton founded Lesbians and Gay Support the Minors, and we also at LGSM, of course, twinned with the mining community in South Wales. So the miners were in desperate struggle, and we went to support them in their struggle, because unless everybody's free, nobody's free. And so it's no good just fighting for LGBT+ equality. You have at the same time to fight for the equality of everybody.
When you think about it, it's quite illogical to actually say, well, I'm gay and I'm into defending the gay community, but I don't care about anything else. It's ludicrous. It's important that if you're defending communities, that you also defend all communities and not just one. And that's one of the reasons, that's the main reason why I'm involved in it.
Mark's really important to me. He's had a major effect on my life. He hadn't been political when he was a young teenager. He went to live with his father for a short while in Bangladesh. And Mark had never seen such poverty as he saw in Bangladesh. That affected him so much that when he came back to Britain, although he carried on being a fun-loving kind of guy, he also started to kind of learn about politics. And Mark was the kind of person who, once he decided to do something, it would be absolutely non-stop. So he kind of got involved in his local community, as well as kind of wider politics. So he saw a need to be involved in as much as he possibly could. I think it's great that he's been chosen for LGBT plus History Month. He is an inspiration and he's a role model, I think, for a younger generation. And indeed, that's since the movie Pride came out, that's what's happened to him. I've met loads of people in their teens and their early 20s who are absolutely besotted with Mark, and that's really touching. And it is the teenagers in particular who really, really have taken the movie Pride to heart. I think that's just so lovely at that age, that is guiding them and influencing them. That's good for a future generation. It's quite heartwarming.
What a fascinating evening this has been. I've not heard of these stories before, and it's absolutely amazing, especially the links with the 1926 miners' strike and LGBT solidarity. So I'm Mike Jackson. I'm going to speak about a little bit more about Mark, tell you about his biographical details. He was born in Oldham, Lancashire, which is about 20 miles from Accrington, where I grew up, although obviously we didn't know each other as young children. Both were solidly working class mill towns, part of what was known as Cottonopolis. And his father renovated and installed redundant textile machinery in developing countries, which meant the family relocated in search of work. When Mark was an infant, they moved from Lancashire to Portrush in Northern Ireland, and that's where he grew up as a youngster. The nearest sizable town was Derry, otherwise known as Londonderry, which then was a crucible of the armed conflicts between the nationalists, who were mainly Catholic, and the Unionists, who were mainly Protestant. Most notably, Derry is sadly remembered for Bloody Sunday, where in 1972, British soldiers shot dead 26 unarmed civilians who were peacefully protesting against internment. To put it in context, Mark was then 12 years old with all this going on around him. Throughout his youth, there was this backdrop of armed British soldiers and armoured vehicles on the streets. Everywhere there were political slogans and murals on walls and pavements of both sides of the conflict. But despite the tensions and tragedies, an alternative youth culture was emerging. Amongst Mark's friends were young musicians who formed the now legendary group, The Undertones, whose biggest hits was Teenage Kits, a great favourite of John Peel's. He met his best friend Monty at Catering College in Portrush in 1976, and the two of them both discovered that they were gay. By 1981, they both moved to London, loving the hustle, bustle, music, fashion, dancing and clubs. Monty says that Mark would spend 3 hours on his outfits and makeup before they went out. In 1982, Mark went to visit his family, who were now living in Bangladesh, where his father was fitting looms and other textile machinery. There, for 3 months, the experience for Mark of witnessing sick, homeless kids begging from him shocked him and changed how he looked at life. He started to take a more serious look at what was going on around him. Returning to London, he volunteered for London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard, which was a 24/7 support service for LGBT plus people. He also joined the Young Communist League. He threw himself into activism, learning, reading and going to meetings. And it was around this time in London that Mark and Monty met Jimmy Somerville, another working class gay young man, in his case hailing from Glasgow. Jimmy had been working on a video project called Framed Youth, which you can find online, and he interviewed Mark for the documentary. As Mark's energies poured into his work with the Communist Party, Jimmy's went into forming the band Bronski Beat, but all that hard work needed a release, and they would often go out for a night on the town. Look out, London. I met Mark for the first time in 1983 when he interviewed me to become a volunteer also on Switchboard. We became close friends, especially with our mutual bonds of commitment to gay liberation and socialism, and a bit of hedonism too. 12 months later, Thatcher provoked the miners' strike, which in turn led him to form Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners, which, as you probably all know, is depicted today in Stephen Burford's award-winning movie Pride. Within 3 years, though, we lost our Mark to HIV/AIDS on the 11th of February 1987. It was very sudden. He was diagnosed in Guy's Hospital with PCP and died just days later.
There were hundreds at his funeral. His family, of course, but mainly people in their 20s were there, and also some mining families we knew from South Wales. Mark was mind, body and spirit rolled into one. He changed the world, and Jimmy Somerville wrote for a friend in Mark's memory. We are all proud of Mark being chosen for the LGBT plus History Month 2021 as someone who played a significant role in changing history for the better. And now I'll hand you over to Amy from the Proud Trust. Thank you.
For many years, the Trust has worked closely with youth groups, schools, colleges, and other organisations that work with young people. We have had the pleasure of working with Sue for years, and to support in marking and celebrating LGBT History Month, we design a 4-session pack each year that can be found at proudtrust.org and is completely free to download. I'm here to share with you some information about this year's pack. The 4 sessions this year are Designing the Badge for History Month 2022. As well as designing the badge, this looks at the importance of allyship and the work Mark Ashton and LGSM did in supporting the mining community. Body, a barrier to participation, highlights LGBT plus athletes like Mark Weston and Lily Parr, but also looks at the barriers that many LGBT plus people continue to face when accessing sports, games and training. Mind, Still I Rise, an exploration of one of Maya Angelou's most famous works. And Spirit, Symbols and Identity, which I'm going to share with you on the following slides. So if you could move to slide 2, please. So this year, with COVID changing the way we work, our History Month sessions have changed slightly. Schools have been under a lot of pressure to ensure that they cover the curriculum, and workload for teachers is immense. So we have ensured each session links to the National Curriculum for England and can be delivered as part of an art, English, DT or PSHE lesson. To hopefully save staff time, each session has been written as both a lesson plan and a PowerPoint and can be found with other LGBT inclusive resources on the Rainbow Flag Award Classroom. And on to slide 3, please. So you should be able to see some cards for a match-up task, matching symbols to the communities that they represent. You'll see a mix of different faiths, sexualities, gender identities, and more. We are aware that activities that require printed resources cannot be done in virtual spaces such as this. So as to ensure that the activities are accessible for these groups, each session is written as 2 versions, one for delivering in person and one for delivering online. With youth groups continuing online, we are writing separate instructions for how tasks like this can be done in a virtual space and still be interactive for everyone. And the next slide, please. The purpose of looking at these various and different identities and communities is to highlight that we all have various aspects to our own identity, and LGBT plus people are more than just their sexuality or gender identity. Michael Dillon has been primarily remembered for being a trans man, but as Cheryl shared, he was much more than this. He was a physician, he was an author, he was a Buddhist, and so on. So moving on to the next slide, this leads to this task, which encourages our young people to think about the intersectionality of their own identity. They are tasked in this session with creating a symbol that represents themselves. So I just wanted to briefly share one of our sessions with you so you can hopefully see how we've included all 5 faces of 2021. You can see how the sessions are interactive, and although they are aimed at ages 11 upwards, many of the activities are easily adaptable for younger ages and their families. Once again, if you are interested in this pack, they will be live on the proudtrust.org in the new year. They are free to download and ready to deliver. Thank you, and I'm now going to hand back to Dan for our Q&A.
Thank you very much, Amy. And thank you so much to all of our presenters as well. It was amazing to hear about all those stories. And I can see already that the feeds have been lighting up with lots of people really enthused by what you've shared today as well. So thank you very much for doing all of that. I do want to just cover off something very quickly. Because we broached some difficult topics, I would like to just offer up the contact details for Switchboard. So SWITCHBOARD.LGBT, and the telephone number is 0330 021 1529. You can find it easily on the website, which is SWITCHBOARD.LGBT, because if you are going through difficult times, you can always reach out to them. It's a great counselling service and they're always there for you. So Schools Out UK and LGBT History Month, it's about using history to help us understand us now in the present day, by using history to help us understand us now, and that helps us sort of map the way forward. It's about shaping our future. So I wanted the panel to be involved in this by also using their lived experience to answer some of these questions. And some of the Q&A questions, of course, you can always use the question drop down here, so they'll come through and I can ask the questions for you. But I wanted to pick up, first of all, on our two radicals, our activists. So starting off with Mark Ashton, Maya Angelou. I want to ask, first of all, to Kamara, and then we'll go to Mike. What can we learn from them? Because at the moment, it's pretty safe to say we are facing a lot of strong opposition. So what can we learn from them and their practice throughout their own life? Kamara.
I guess the main thing that I spoke about in the talk was the balance, I guess, of care and critique. So like not just like recognizing, right, the structure and inequalities that we're all dealing with, but also how we can, what structural power do each of us have, and how can we use that to not just enact change, but to support the most marginalized and vulnerable within LGBT community. I think that's a message that seems resonant to me from my engagement with Maya Angelou's work, and I'm sure feels resonant for a lot of other people who also engage with her work, trying to kind of move in this like model of loving kindness, and also recognize kind of like the personal responsibility and accountability that we all have, and not kind of taking that on for yourself as opposed to passing it to someone else to try and achieve.
Thank you very much, Kamara. And Mike, have you got...
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose if you wanted to sum up in one word what LGSM achieved was solidarity, and that's a word that's always been around and always will be, and probably one of the most important words that we know in language. It's through solidarity that you get allies, and the LGBT plus community is and will always be a minority community. I don't think there's any doubt about that, really. And so we need allies like nobody needs allies, yeah. But equally, we've got to look within our own community to make sure that we push racism away and sexism away. So we've got work to do within our own community, and equally work to do to kind of unite with the rest of the community, because your struggle is my struggle. That's the way I look at it, and I'm sure that's the way Mark would have looked at it. Everybody's struggle is my struggle. Black Lives Matter to me, and it's irrelevant the fact that I've got a white skin. It's the same struggle, and we need to just unite and keep fighting for our freedom and everybody's freedom. Oppression doesn't really benefit anybody. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, at the moment, we're also seeing some dramatic changes. You've mentioned Black Lives Matter. There's also the massive change in our lives because of lockdown. The other thing that we're seeing, I mentioned social media before, the other thing we're seeing is lots of transphobia on social media. For us, inclusion is critical in what we do. But, how can we help do it better? And I'd love to sort of start with maybe Cheryl, and then we'll go to Lou in terms of looking at that idea of how can we do inclusion better?
Well, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that the transphobia we're seeing in the UK is really quite unique in the Western world. If we look at what's happening in America at the moment, there's a whole bunch of trans people who are getting elected to public office, the most high-profile one being Sarah McBride, who's become a senator. There are only like just over 100 of those in the whole of the United States. That's a really, really powerful political position. And yet here in the UK, we have politicians of all parties, and in particular of the Labour Party, speaking out in quite horrible ways about trans people. So we've got a problem in this country, and I really don't know what we can do to fix it, because there isn't anybody fighting for us apart from us down at grassroots level. The media are against us, the politicians are against us. It's very, very grim, and it has been for several years now. But all we can do is work up from the ground level. And I think maybe you can see that with what happened in Georgia in the US, where people working at a ground level with Stacey Abrams and whoever have managed, I think, fingers crossed, to turn the state around for the Democrats. So we need to work together. And as Mike said, solidarity is going to be the key to that. Trans people can't do it on our own. Most estimates say we're less than 1% of the population, and that's a vanishingly small group. So we need allies, and we need to work with other people. So that's the way I see it, and I think that does happen. And interestingly, it happens across time. A couple of days back, I was doing an interview with my friend Professor Oliver Tortelli about her new book, African Europeans, and she has a whole bunch of people that she highlights in that book who are people from Africa who lived in Europe and did amazing and interesting things. And in 3 of those, once in the Roman Empire, once just before the French Revolution, and once in post-Napoleonic Russia, those people that she highlighted had been friends with either trans or intersex people. So people who are marginalized know each other and tend to work together. And fingers crossed we can continue to do that.
Thank you. I mean, when you say it brings up that idea again of the fact that we've always been here. And so I think that's the other thing to remember as well. We have always been here.
Sorry, by the way, Mike, don't give up hope, because in the Roman Empire, like, everybody was queer. It was the norm. So we could yet be in the majority. Trans people won't be, but queer people could well be.
I want to turn to your idea about the grassroots as well, though. And who better to turn to when talking about grassroots than Lou Engelfield? Because one of the things you're doing, Lou, is, politics is what Cheryl was talking about. We're going to talk about sports with you. There's a lot to be addressed there as well still, but I think grassroots do actually get through some of that, don't they? They're able to cut through some of that.
I think one of the things that we're seeing in sport at the moment, particularly around trans people and the representation of trans people, is the weaponization of sport. So I find it particularly frustrating that, for example, a handful of years ago, we were talking about, the very, very fine margins between, cisgender men and cisgender women's performance. And now it's all about how weak and vulnerable cisgender women are and how they're totally under threat by trans women. And of course, that's a load of nonsense and totally goes against, the discourse around women's sport and the empowerment of women's sport. And so, one of the things I think is really important for us is resistance to resist the hijacking of sport at all levels. And I think, Dan, talking about grassroots is really, really, really important, because that's where we can make a real change, having conversations with people, not staying silent, making sure that you talk to people about what's really, really going on. And, we can't always wait for the mega stars to talk about these issues. We have to show them some leadership. We have to take those conversations forward. So in football, there aren't a great deal of people talking about transphobia at the moment, but we launched our Football versus Transphobia Week of Action 2 years ago. And all we have done really within that space is just try and dispel some of the myths particularly about trans women in the game, and highlight some of the absolutely brilliant women who are playing football at a grassroots level and just getting on with our lives. Because the best way to stop people being demonized is to represent the reality, to resist that demonization, resist that hijacking of sport, and show people for who they really are.
Thank you. We've just had a question come in from Melissa Hawker, and Melissa says that it's a fantastic event. There have been brilliant presentations, so thank you, Melissa. Melissa is actually from Ancient House LGBT plus History Month Hub, which is going to be a hub for next year. And as part of that group, there is a Teenage History Club. So it's a group of teenagers who look into queer history. And Melissa says that they're on a roller coaster of emotions right now. And thank you so much to Kamara for the breathing together moment, because that was very special. I'm going to go to Amy and then Alan, because you're both very involved with education. You're both in institutions. And I'd like to ask what Melissa's question is, which is, what would you tell your teenage self from your current perspective? And what are your hopes for what might change the teenagers of today and what they might see in their own lifetime? So, Amy?
it's a big question. I think I would tell my teenage self that there is not one way to be LGBT. I think representation of the community is so important, and representing the variety of our community as well. I think growing up, I felt there was one way to be LGBT, and I had to look a certain way and act a certain way. And there were certain expectations of me, and that's not the case at all. And I think that's the biggest message that we need to share with our young LGBT people, that they can achieve anything and they shouldn't feel limited by this part of their identity if, in fact, there's an entire community of people backing them. So I think that's the biggest message I'd share.
Thank you. And Alan?
I guess for me, and I'm going to show my age now, I would tell my teenage self not to be scared, because I was really, really scared my whole life. And I do a lot of work in schools now, and obviously teach at the university, and you know, students will say to me, well, when did that fear of being different go away? And I'm like, do you know what? I don't think it has. I think I've just internalized it and work with it. And I'm really, really keen that the next generation don't feel that fear. Do you know what I mean? Because, and heritage is such an important part of that, because you need to see yourself, you know, in the world around you and in the history books and things. And if you see yourself, then you're much less scared. So hopefully the teenage me wouldn't have taken till 28 to come out, I guess, today. Let's hope, you know, younger people are on a much faster track to get to where they feel they want to be. And yeah, I think that's why events like this are so important.
Thank you. I mean, Sue, I'm going to turn to you now as well, because you've been with Schools Out UK for, I daren't even guess how long. You might want to tell me, but you are there with the schools, with the children and with the students. So what have you seen change throughout that time?
I think the biggest change has been the fact that we are talking about LGBT issues in schools now. I mean, when I was back as a teenager myself, and I'm now 73, so you can do the maths. We were totally invisible. And then, of course, we had the 80s, which was very hard. We had Section 28. And then we really wanted to make ourselves visible, which was, in a sense, the whole point of setting up LGBT History Month. So I think we are seeing teachers embracing diversity more and working to make not only LGBT people visible, but all the protected strands visible. I'm still very worried about the lack of education around disability. But I think schools are now being much more aware and much stronger, but there is a backlash, and the DfE at the moment isn't being very helpful. So I think we need to be very aware of our connections with the unions, with other teachers, with other communities, so that we can continue to make the classroom a really safe space for everybody.
Thank you. And Kamara, if I could just pick on you one more time, because I think it's probably safe to say that you're probably the youngest among us. So you're the closest to possibly what well, the teenage years. So maybe an answer for the Teenage History Club at Ancient House?
I just think it's so important to be consistently engaging with kind of, I think Amy mentioned this too, like what queerness means to you and how you can define that. But really, the message I'd give, and what I would have given to myself, is to actually listen to elders within the community. There's a wealth of knowledge that will be forgotten if we, as young people, don't continue to acknowledge those histories and to make sure we're sharing them and embodying them and embodying the struggle and the good moments.
Absolutely, the good moments. Well, I think that these are the final moments now as well of this particular event. So I'm going to ask Sue now if you are able to please give us our final thank yous, because it has come to time. It's been such a wonderful event. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and our presenters for today.
Well, I certainly want to thank the British Library and you, Dan, for enabling this very exciting launch, and everybody else who's been part of it. I have to say it's been a very poignant one for me, doing it without Tony Fenwick, who died this year and who'd been with us for 25 years and been our CEO for the last 6. He is so much missed. And I also want to thank Steve Boyce, who's been with us since the beginning of LGBT History Month and was the chair of trustees and who retired this year. We are lucky that very talented new people have joined our dedicated trustees and management committee to make LGBT History Month happen. Well, LGBT History Month can be celebrated in so many different ways. Looking at the past year, the calendar has hundreds of events, ranging from quizzes to conferences, film nights to discos, flag raising, and rainbowizing zebra crossings. We do need to be aware that there is a backlash against our progress, so we must be ready to support each other, particularly making sure that all young people, whoever they are, receive the vital information that enables them to be confident, comfortable, and proud of who they are. I know that despite the pandemic and potential lockdown, our community's creativity will ensure that LGBT History Month 2021 will not only still go ahead, but will be fun, fabulous, and inspiring as always. Can I thank you for watching and everybody who's here for a fabulous evening and hopefully an amazing 21.
And it wouldn't be an LGBT plus History Month event if we didn't flash our badges at you. So I'm going to ask for the slide with the badges to come up right now. So as you can see on the screen, this is the design for 2021 and they are available in the shop. So please do follow that link all the way through to get a hold of them, because it is really important for us right now to have your support. And we, of course, appreciate it deeply. The theme is, of course, mind, body, and spirit. And as you can see, there's also an invitation there to think about what you might design for future ones, but do get a hold of the one coming up for 2021. So please follow that through. So thank you very much, Sue, so much to Sue Sanders and to the Schools Out UK team. I would also like to thank the British Library teams, so that's Jonah Albert, Maxine Pons-Webster, Cecile Communal and Rob Field, and all the libraries who are joining us across the Living Knowledge Network. It is wonderful to have you all tuned in as well. So many people today. And I'd also love to thank the Unique Media team who are headed up by Rebecca Godley, who are doing the tech, and also to Louisa McDade, who's very kindly doing the captions for us. Also, as you've seen on the logos that you've seen throughout the videos, thank you so much to the NEU and also to the Proud Trust for their support this evening. It means so much to us, so thank you. Big plus to all of the speakers and the partner organizations and the people who agreed to be filmed for us. And really, that's kind of almost it, right? Thank you so much to you for coming along, because it's about you. We've got 20 hubs coming up for Outing the Past next year, but I hope this has got you thinking about what you can do to mark LGBT plus History Month in February next year as well. Because what you do makes a huge difference. Your actions will change the lives of your family, of your school, of your community. So please get involved and plan as many events as possible. And I think that's all there is left to say. So thank you. I've been Dan Vo, and I'm sending you rainbows and wishing you a wonderful night. Thank you for joining us.